I was 32, newly divorced, and eager for a fresh start. Little did I know that my search for a new beginning would lead me to the brink of madness and change my perception of reality forever. What I'm about to tell you happened 2 years ago, but the memory of it still sends chills down my spine. The real estate agent's smile never quite reached her eyes as she handed me the keys to my new home. "Congratulations, Mr. Parker," she said, her voice a little too cheerful. "I'm sure you'll be very happy here." I nodded, trying to ignore the knot of anxiety in my stomach. The house was perfect on paper, a beautiful Victorian in a quiet neighborhood, spacious enough for my home office, and surprisingly affordable. Yet something about it made me uneasy from the moment I first saw it. As we walked through the rooms one last time, the agent's heels clicking on the hardwood floors, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching us. Shadows seemed to linger a little too long in the corners, and the air felt heavier than it should have. "Oh, one last thing," the agent said as we reached the kitchen. She pointed to a door I hadn't noticed before, half hidden behind the pantry. "That leads to the basement, but I'm afraid it's locked. The previous owners lost the key years ago, and we haven't been able to find a locksmith willing to tackle that old lock." I frowned. "Is that going to be a problem?" She waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, not at all. The inspector checked the foundation from the outside, and everything's sound. Besides," she added with a laugh that sounded forced, "sometimes it's better not to disturb old houses too much. They can be temperamental." I should have paid more attention to the warning in her words, but I was too excited about my new beginning to dwell on it. I signed the final papers, took the keys, and watched as the agent hurried to her car, driving away a little faster than necessary. That night, as I lay in bed surrounded by half-unpacked boxes, I heard a sound that would become all too familiar in the coming weeks. A soft scratching, as if something was trying to claw its way through the walls. I dismissed it as the house settling, or maybe mice in the attic. But deep down, a part of me knew that this was just the beginning of something far more sinister. The first few days in the house were uneventful. I threw myself into unpacking and setting up my home office, trying to ignore the occasional creaks and groans that seemed to echo through the empty rooms. But as the week wore on, I began to notice things that were harder to explain away. It started small. I'd come home to find a book on the coffee table when I was sure I'd left it on the shelf. Or I'd wake up to find all the kitchen cabinets open, though I distinctly remembered closing them before bed. Each time, I'd rationalize it. I must have forgotten, or maybe I was more absent-minded than I thought. But then the incidents became more difficult to dismiss. One morning, I woke to find all the framed photos in the living room turned face down. When I righted them, I could have sworn I heard a low, angry growl coming from somewhere deep within the house. The scratching sounds at night grew louder, no longer confined to the walls but seeming to come from directly beneath my feet. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I'd hear what sounded like whispers, too faint to make out words, but unmistakably human. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. The stress of the move, the lingering pain of my divorce, the isolation of working from home. Surely these were playing tricks on my mind. But even as I clung to these rational explanations, a part of me knew I was lying to myself. One evening, as I was making dinner, I reached for a glass in the cabinet. My hand brushed against something sticky. When I pulled it back, my fingers were smeared with a dark, viscous substance that looked disturbingly like blood. I stared at it in horror, my heart pounding, and then, as if the house was mocking me, I heard a child's laughter echoing from somewhere deep below, from the direction of the locked basement door. That was the moment I knew, with chilling certainty, that I was not alone in this house. And whatever was sharing it with me was anything but human. As the days turned into weeks, The strange occurrences in the house intensified. What had started as subtle disturbances now became impossible to ignore. Objects didn't just move anymore. They flew across rooms when my back was turned. The whispers grew louder, sometimes forming words I could almost understand, always just at the edge of comprehension. But it was the scratches that truly terrified me. They appeared everywhere, on the walls, the floors, even on my bedroom ceiling. Long, deep gouges that couldn't have been made by any animal I knew of. I'd go to sleep in a clean room and wake up surrounded by fresh marks, as if something had spent the night trying to claw its way in. The smell came next. At first, it was just a faint whiff of something rotten, easy to dismiss as a dead animal in the walls. But it grew stronger by the day, a putrid stench that seemed to seep up from the floorboards. It was strongest near the locked basement door, a fact that filled me with a dread I couldn't quite explain. I tried everything to get rid of the smell. I scrubbed the floors, sprayed air fresheners, even called a plumber to check for sewer issues. Nothing helped. The stench lingered, sometimes fading only to return stronger than ever, as if whatever was causing it was toying with me. One night, unable to sleep due to the overwhelming odor, I decided to examine the basement door more closely. As I approached it, the smell became so strong I gagged. But something else caught my attention, a sound coming from behind the door. It was rhythmic, almost like breathing, heart pounding. I pressed my ear against the wood. The breathing grew louder, more labored. Then, suddenly, it stopped. In the silence that followed, I heard a single word whispered directly into my ear. Soon. I jerked back, stumbling away from the door. As I watched, paralyzed with fear, dark liquid began to seep from under it, spreading across the kitchen floor. It wasn't water. It was too thick, too dark. It looked like blood. I ran from the kitchen, locking myself in my bedroom. As I huddled under the covers, shaking, I realized I could no longer deny the truth. Something evil was in this house, and it was getting stronger. In the light of day, it was easier to doubt what I'd experienced. Maybe the stress was getting to me. Maybe I was having some kind of breakdown. These thoughts circled in my mind as I went about my daily routine, trying to ignore the lingering smell and the fresh scratches that appeared each morning. I threw myself into work, hoping that keeping busy would help me rationalize the inexplicable events. But concentration became impossible. Every creak of the house made me jump. Every shadow in my peripheral vision seemed to move. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see some monstrous form lurking behind me. Sleep became a luxury I could no longer afford. When I did manage to drift off, my dreams were plagued by visions of dark, twisting corridors and the sound of something massive dragging itself up creaking stairs. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I could feel hot, fetid breath on my face. During my waking hours, I oscillated between terror and self-doubt. One moment, I was certain that I was being haunted by something beyond human understanding. The next, I was berating myself for letting my imagination run wild. Surely there had to be a logical explanation for everything. I began to research the house's history, hoping to find some rational cause for the disturbances. But every lead I followed turned into a dead end. The local library had no records of any tragic events at the address. Online searches yielded nothing out of the ordinary. As the fear and doubt warred within me, I found myself standing more and more often in front of the basement door. Something about it drew me, even as every instinct screamed at me to stay away. I'd catch myself with my hand on the doorknob, not remembering how I got there. Deep down, I knew that whatever answers I sought lay behind that locked door. But I was terrified of what I might find if it ever opened. Little did I know, My moment of truth was approaching faster than I could have ever imagined. Determined to uncover the truth about my house, I decided to take a more proactive approach. I started with my neighbors, hoping they might have some insight into the property's history. But my attempts at friendly conversation were met with tight smiles and evasive answers. Mrs. Jenkins, the elderly woman next door, seemed particularly uncomfortable when I mentioned the basement. "Some things are best left alone, dear," she said, her eyes darting nervously to my house. "If I were you, I'd leave that door locked." Frustrated, I turned to the local historical society. The clerk there, a bespectacled man with a permanent frown, rifled through dusty records for hours before shaking his head. "Nothing unusual about that property," he muttered. But as I turned to leave, he grabbed my arm. "Be careful," he whispered. "Some houses have secrets they don't want uncovered." My search for answers led me down increasingly bizarre paths. I consulted psychics, who refused to enter the house after just one look. I spoke with paranormal investigators, who listened to my story with growing excitement but never followed up. Even the Catholic Church turned me away when I inquired about exorcisms, the young priest's face pale as he ushered me out. As my investigation hit one dead end after another, the activity in the house intensified. The scratching in the walls became a constant backdrop to my days and nights. The putrid smell grew so strong that I took to sleeping with a clothespin on my nose. And the whispers. The whispers became clearer, more insistent. "Let us out," they seemed to say. "Open the door." I knew they meant the basement door, but every time I approached it, a primal fear gripped me. Something terrible waited on the other side, something that both terrified and beckoned me. One night, as I sat in my living room, surrounded by useless research and empty coffee cups, I heard a new sound. A slow, heavy dragging, punctuated by the creak of wood. It was coming from the basement stairs. My heart pounding, I realized with dawning horror that whatever was down there was trying to come up, and the door that had kept it contained for so long was starting to give way. It was just past midnight when I jolted awake, my heart racing. The house was eerily quiet, the usual scratching and whispering conspicuously absent. Then I heard it, a loud, splintering crack from downstairs. The basement door had finally given way. Paralyzed with fear, I lay in bed, straining my ears. Slow, heavy footsteps creaked on the stairs, accompanied by a wet, dragging sound. Something was coming up from the basement. Something big. Panic propelled me into action. I scrambled out of bed, fumbling for my phone. But as I tried to dial 911, the screen went black, an acrid smell of burnt electronics filling the air. The footsteps were in the hallway now, getting closer to my bedroom. I could hear labored breathing, and beneath it, a low, guttural growl that no human throat could produce. With trembling hands, I wedged a chair under my doorknob, knowing it was a futile gesture. Whatever was out there wasn't going to be stopped by a flimsy wooden door. The footsteps stopped right outside my room. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then a voice spoke, if you could call it a voice. It was like 1,000 whispers layered over each other, echoing with age and malice. "We're free," it said. "Thanks to you." The door began to splinter, huge cracks appearing in the wood. Through the gaps, I caught glimpses of something dark and writhing, with too many limbs and eyes that glowed like embers. In that moment of pure terror, my survival instinct kicked in. I ran to the window, throwing it open. My bedroom was on the second floor, but I didn't hesitate. As the door finally gave way, I leapt out into the night. I hit the ground hard, pain shooting through my ankle, but adrenaline numbed it as I scrambled to my feet and ran. Behind me, I heard an inhuman roar of fury and the sound of shattering glass. I ran down the street, not daring to look back. Houses flew by in a blur, their windows dark and unhelpful. I could hear it behind me, its many limbs scrabbling on the pavement, getting closer with each second. Just as I felt hot breath on the back of my neck, I saw salvation, a church, its doors miraculously open even at this late hour. I put on a final burst of speed and threw myself inside, slamming the doors shut behind me. The thing outside howled in frustration, a sound that made my blood run cold. I could see its shadow through the stained glass windows, massive and misshapen. It circled the church for what felt like hours, occasionally throwing itself against the doors. But it couldn't enter. As dawn broke, I heard one final, furious roar, then silence. When I finally found the courage to peek outside, the street was empty. But in the distance, I could see my house. Even from here, I could tell that the basement door was wide open, a gaping maw of darkness. I knew then that I could never go back. Whatever had been trapped in that basement was now free, and it was my fault. As I slumped against the church wall, exhausted and terrified, I realized that my life would never be the same again. As I sat in the church, trembling and exhausted, the full weight of what had happened began to sink in. The creature I had glimpsed, the thing that had chased me through the night, defied all logic and reason. It was a nightmare made flesh, a horror that shouldn't exist in our world. My mind raced back to all the signs I had ignored or rationalized away. The scratches on the walls weren't just random marks. They were a message, a desperate attempt to communicate. The putrid smell wasn't from dead animals or faulty plumbing. It was the stench of something ancient and evil, long imprisoned. As the sun rose higher, casting long shadows through the stained glass windows, I forced myself to confront the truth. The basement of my house had been a prison, holding back a malevolent entity for who knows how long. And I, in my ignorance and curiosity, had been the key to its release. I closed my eyes, and unbidden images flashed through my mind. I saw the creature more clearly now, a writhing mass of darkness, with tentacles that ended in clawed hands. Its body seemed to shift and change, never settling on one form. But its eyes remained constant, burning orbs of hatred and hunger, filled with an intelligence that was terrifyingly alien. I remembered its voice, that cacophony of whispers that had thanked me for freeing it. What had it meant? Had my very presence in the house somehow weakened its prison? Or had my constant attention to the basement door acted as some kind of summoning? As I pondered these horrifying possibilities, a new thought struck me. If this thing had been trapped in my basement, how many other houses held similar secrets? How many other unsuspecting homeowners were living above ancient horrors, separated only by a locked door and their own blissful ignorance? The sound of the church door opening startled me from my thoughts. An elderly priest entered, his eyes widening in surprise at my disheveled appearance. "My child," he said gently, "what troubles you?" I looked up at him, tears streaming down my face. "Father," I croaked, my voice hoarse from screaming, "I've done something terrible. I've released a monster into the world." The priest's expression changed from concern to grim understanding. He sat beside me, placing a comforting hand on my shoulder. "Tell me everything," he said. And so, as the morning light filled the church, I began my story, hoping that in confession I might find some way to undo the horror I had unleashed. The priest listened to my tale with a grave expression, nodding occasionally but never interrupting. When I finished, he sat in silence for a long moment, his brow furrowed in thought. "What you've encountered," he finally said, "is something beyond my expertise. But I know someone who might be able to help. For now, though, You need to get as far away from that house as possible." His words galvanized me into action. With shaking hands, I called a cab and directed it to the nearest hotel. As we drove past my street, I saw police cars and an ambulance outside my house. Neighbors stood on their lawns, pointing and whispering. I slumped down in the seat, a mix of guilt and relief washing over me. At the hotel, I locked myself in a room on the highest floor, pushing furniture against the door. Exhaustion finally overcame my fear, and I fell into a fitful sleep plagued by nightmares of writhing tentacles and glowing eyes. I woke to pounding on the door. Panicked, I looked for a weapon, only to realize it was the cleaning staff. The sunlight streaming through the windows seemed to mock the terrors of the night before. As I sat on the bed, trying to calm my racing heart, my phone buzzed with a news alert. The headline made my blood run cold. Mysterious disappearances reported in suburban neighborhood. The article mentioned strange noises and a foul odor reported by residents near my house. 3 people had gone missing overnight, last seen walking towards my street. Guilt and horror overwhelmed me. This was my fault. That thing was out there, hunting because of me. I had to do something, but what? I was just one person, up against a monster I barely understood. As I grappled with my conscience, a text came through from an unknown number. "Meet me at St. Michael's Church at sunset. Bring salt. Fr. Thomas." It seemed I had an ally in my fight against the darkness. But was it already too late to stop what I had set in motion? The days that followed were a blur of fear, guilt, and desperate planning. I met with Father Thomas at St. Michael's Church, where he introduced me to a group of individuals who specialized in dealing with supernatural threats. They listened to my story with grim faces, occasionally exchanging knowing glances. "What you've unleashed is an ancient evil," one of them explained. "It's been trapped for centuries, growing stronger, waiting for someone to set it free." The weight of my actions crushed me. People were missing, possibly dead, because of my curiosity and ignorance. The creature was out there, feeding, growing stronger with each passing day. We formulated a plan to confront the entity, to try and seal it away once more. But the risks were enormous. Many of the group's members had died in similar confrontations. As we prepared for the battle ahead, I grappled with a difficult decision. Part of me wanted to stay, to fight, to try and undo the damage I had caused. But another part, a part one was ashamed to admit existed, wanted to run as far away as possible and never look back. In the end, the decision was made for me. News reports showed that the disappearances were spreading, moving outward from my old neighborhood. The creature was on the move, and it seemed to be following me. I knew then that I couldn't run. This was my responsibility, my burden to bear. Whatever the cost, I had to face this horror and try to stop it. With a heavy heart and trembling hands, I agreed to be part of the group's plan. As we made our final preparations, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking towards my doom. It's been 6 months since that fateful night when we confronted the entity. The battle was brutal, leaving scars both physical and mental that I'll carry for the rest of my life. We managed to seal the creature away again, but at a terrible cost. Half of our group didn't survive, and those of us who did are forever changed. I've moved far away from that cursed house, settling in a small apartment in a bustling city. The anonymity of urban life offers some comfort, but I know now that no place is truly safe. The veil between our world and the realm of nightmares is thinner than most people realize. Sleep is still difficult. When I do manage to drift off, my dreams are plagued by visions of writhing darkness and echoing whispers. I've learned to live with the nightmares, to accept them as penance for my unwitting role in unleashing that horror upon the world. I've become hyper-aware of the hidden dangers that might lurk in old houses, abandoned buildings, or even in the shadowy corners of ordinary homes. Every locked door, every unexplained sound, sets my nerves on edge. Sometimes, I consider trying to warn others about the potential dangers hidden in their homes. But who would believe me? And would sharing this knowledge do more harm than good? So I keep my secrets, and I remain vigilant. I know now that there are things in this world beyond human understanding, forces of darkness that prey on our curiosity and ignorance. My experience has taught me a harsh lesson. Sometimes, it's better to leave some doors locked, some mysteries unsolved. As I write these final words, I can't help but wonder, how many other ancient evils are out there, waiting for someone like me to unwittingly set them free? And when the next one emerges, will anyone be prepared to face it? I was 35, recently divorced, and eager for a fresh start. The quaint two-story home in a quiet suburb seemed perfect, affordable, spacious, and far from the memories of my failed marriage. Little did I know that this search for a new beginning would lead me to question the very nature of reality and leave me forever changed. What I'm about to tell you happened just 6 months ago, but the experience still haunts my every waking moment. From the moment I first stepped into the house, I was drawn to its charm. The creaky hardwood floors, the large windows that let in streams of sunlight, and the cozy fireplace in the living room all spoke of a home with character. But it was the basement that truly captured my attention. As the real estate agent led me down the stairs, her heels clicking on the wooden steps, I noticed a peculiar door at the far end of the basement. Unlike the other doors in the house, this one was made of dark, heavy wood, with intricate carvings that seemed to shift when you looked at them too long. "What's behind that door?" I asked, my curiosity piqued. The agent's smile faltered for a moment. "Oh, it's just an old storage space. The previous owners mentioned it doesn't open, probably warped with age. Nothing to worry about." But there was something in her tone, a slight tremor perhaps, that made me wonder if there was more to the story. Still, I was too enamored with the rest of the house to dwell on it. I moved in a week later, slowly filling the rooms with my belongings and trying to make the space feel like home. Yet, no matter what I did, my thoughts kept returning to that strange door in the basement. Sometimes, late at night, I could swear I heard faint sounds coming from behind it. Scratching, whispering, a low hum that seemed to vibrate through the floors. I tried to ignore it, to rationalize it as the house settling or my imagination running wild in a new environment. But the door called to me, its mystery an itch I couldn't scratch. Little did I know that my curiosity would soon lead me down a path from which there was no return. It was a stormy night in late autumn when everything changed. The wind howled outside, rain lashing against the windows with a fury that seemed almost personal. I had been living in the house for about a month, and while I had grown accustomed to its quirks, the creaky floorboard in the hallway, the way the pipes rattled when I ran the hot water, I still hadn't shaken my fascination with the basement door. As lightning illuminated the sky, casting eerie shadows through the house, I found myself unable to sleep. The storm's intensity seemed to be building, each thunderclap louder than the last. It was during one of these thunderous booms that I heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the tempest outside. A click, followed by the slow creak of hinges long and used. My heart raced as I sat up in bed, straining my ears. There it was again, the unmistakable sound of a door opening, coming from the basement. Part of me wanted to huddle under the covers, to pretend I hadn't heard anything. But a stronger part, the part that had been obsessed with the mysterious door since I first laid eyes on it, propelled me out of bed. I grabbed a flashlight from my bedside drawer and crept down the stairs, my bare feet silent on the cold wood. The basement door loomed before me, slightly ajar. Taking a deep breath, I pulled it open and descended into the darkness below. The beam of my flashlight danced across the familiar contours of the basement. The old washing machine, boxes of holiday decorations, shelves lined with tools. But as the light reached the far wall, I froze. The carved wooden door stood wide open. Where there had once been solid wall behind it, a dark corridor now stretched into the distance, seeming to absorb the light from my flashlight. A cool breeze wafted from the opening, carrying with it a scent I couldn't quite place. Musty, yet somehow fresh, like the air from another world. My hands trembled as I stood at the threshold of the impossible. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to run upstairs and call the police, or a priest, or anyone who might make sense of this. But the mystery that had plagued me for weeks was finally unfolding, and I couldn't resist its pull. With one last glance back at the familiar confines of my basement, I stepped through the doorway and into the unknown. As I stepped through the doorway, the world seemed to shift around me. The familiar sounds of the storm faded away, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed against my eardrums. The corridor before me defied all logic. It stretched far beyond the confines of my property line, twisting and turning into darkness. The walls of this impossible hallway were a shifting tapestry of shadows and muted colors, reminiscent of my home but distorted, as if seen through a warped mirror. My flashlight beam seemed to be swallowed by the darkness, illuminating only a few feet ahead at a time. I took a tentative step forward, then another. The floor beneath my feet felt solid, yet somehow unstable, as if it might give way at any moment. The air grew thicker as I advanced, carrying a scent that was a bizarre mix of familiar household odors and something alien, almost metallic. As I ventured deeper into the corridor, I noticed framed photographs on the walls. At first glance, they seemed to be pictures of my family and friends, but upon closer inspection, the faces were wrong. Eyes too large, smiles too wide, expressions frozen in a way that sent shivers down my spine. The further I walked, the more the corridor seemed to twist in on itself. I could have sworn I passed the same crooked picture frame multiple times, yet I had been walking in a straight line. Or had I? My sense of direction was completely thrown off in this place. Just as I was considering turning back, I saw a faint glimmer of light ahead. It pulsed softly, beckoning me forward. Against my better judgment, I pressed on, drawn by an insatiable curiosity and the hope that I might find answers to this madness. Little did I know, I was about to step into a world that would challenge everything I thought I knew about reality. As I approached the source of the light, the corridor suddenly opened up into a vast space. I found myself standing in what appeared to be my own living room, but everything was off. The furniture was in the wrong places, the colors were muted and strange, and there was a persistent low hum in the air that I could feel in my bones. But it was what I saw through the windows that truly struck me with horror. Outside, the sky was a sickly green, roiling with clouds that moved too fast to be natural. The trees in my yard were twisted into impossible shapes, their branches reaching towards the ground instead of the sky. As I stood there, frozen in disbelief, I heard movement behind me. I whirled around to see a figure that looked disturbingly like my next-door neighbor, Mrs. Johnson. But this wasn't the kindly old woman who often brought me homemade cookies. This entity had Mrs. Johnson's face, but its eyes were completely black, devoid of any white or iris. Its smile was too wide, stretching literally from ear to ear in a grotesque parody of friendliness. "Welcome, neighbor," it said, its voice a discordant mix of tones that made my skin crawl. "We've been expecting you." I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. As I moved, I caught glimpses of other figures moving in the periphery of my vision. All familiar faces twisted into these nightmarish versions of themselves. I ran out of the living room, through a kitchen that was a warped mirror image of my own, and out into the street. But the street was wrong too. Houses loomed at impossible angles, their windows like gaping mouths ready to swallow me whole. In the distance, I could see more of those entities, all with black eyes and inhuman smiles, all turning to look at me. The sky pulsed overhead, and I felt a wave of vertigo so strong I nearly fell. This world was wrong in every conceivable way, a nightmare made real. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a terrifying thought began to form. What if I couldn't find my way back? I turned to run back to my house, hoping against hope that the door would still be there, that this was all some vivid hallucination. But as I reached the porch, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Through the window, I could see myself, or rather, a version of myself, sitting calmly in an armchair, reading a book, completely unaware of the horrors that surrounded him. I was trapped in a twisted reflection of my world, watching a version of myself live the life I had just left behind. And I had no idea how to get back. Days seemed to pass in this inverted world, though time felt distorted and unreliable. I found myself constantly on the move, avoiding the black-eyed entities that roamed this twisted version of my neighborhood. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching me, waiting for something. As I explored this bizarre reality, I began to notice patterns and differences from my own world. The sun never truly rose or set. Instead, the sickly green sky pulsed with an inner light that waxed and waned unpredictably. Plants grew in impossible ways, some seeming to breathe and move of their own accord. Even the laws of physics seemed different here. Sometimes I'd turn a corner and find myself in a place I logically shouldn't be, as if space itself was folded and warped. I tried to make sense of it all, to find some logic in this madness. I started keeping a journal, jotting down my observations and theories. Perhaps if I could understand this world, I could find a way back to my own. One day, if you could call it that, I stumbled upon what looked like a park. The trees were twisted into spirals, their leaves shimmering with an oily iridescence. In the center stood a fountain, but instead of water, it spewed a thick, black liquid that moved against gravity, flowing upwards into the air before disappearing. As I approached the fountain, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. Carved into its base were symbols that looked eerily similar to the ones on the basement door in my house. Could this be a clue to getting back home? But before I could examine them closer, I heard a familiar voice, my own. I ducked behind one of the spiral trees and watched in horror as the other Meebs strolled through the park, hand in hand with one of the black-eyed entities. They were laughing and talking as if everything was normal. I realized then that this wasn't just a twisted version of my world. It was a complete inversion, where I was the outsider, the anomaly in a world that had its own twisted logic and order. Seeing my doppelganger was a turning point. I became obsessed with observing this other version of myself, trying to understand how he fit into this inverted world. I followed him, always carefully, always from a distance, watching as he went about a life that was a grotesque parody of my own. This other me went to work at a building that seemed to breathe, its walls pulsing like a giant heart. He socialized with the black-eyed entities, seemingly oblivious to their inhuman nature. He ate food that writhed on the plate and drank liquids that glowed with an inner light. But the most disturbing thing was how happy he seemed. This version of me was thriving in a world that filled me with constant terror. He laughed with the entities, touched them without fear, and seemed to understand the twisted logic of this place in a way I couldn't comprehend. One night, as the sky dimmed to a deep, pulsing green, I watched through the window as my other self descended into the basement of our house. My heart raced. Was he going to discover the door, to cross over into my world? But as I peered through the basement window, I saw something that chilled me to my core. The other me approached the spot where the mysterious door should be. But instead of a door, there was a mirror. And in that mirror, I could see myself, the real me, watching from the window. Our eyes met for a split second, and I saw a flicker of recognition in his face. Then he smiled, that same too wide, inhuman smile I'd seen on all the entities here. He raised his hand and waved, as if to say, "I see you." I stumbled back from the window, my mind reeling. The implications were staggering. Was I truly trapped here? Was this other me aware of my presence all along? And most terrifyingly, was he planning to keep me here? I knew then that I had to find a way back to my world, no matter the cost. The longer I stayed in this inverted reality, the more I risked losing myself to its twisted logic. The revelation about my doppelganger spurred me into action. I could no longer afford to be a passive observer in this inverted world. I needed to find a way out. My search for an escape became all-consuming, driving me to explore every corner of this twisted reality. I started by revisiting the park with the strange fountain. The symbols carved into its base seemed to hold some significance, but no matter how long I studied them, their meaning remained elusive. I tried tracing them, rearranging them, even speaking them aloud, but nothing happened. My next approach was to retrace my steps to where I had first entered this world. However, the geography of this place was fluid, constantly shifting. Streets that I remembered taking would suddenly end in cul-de-sacs or loop back on themselves impossibly. The very fabric of space seemed to be working against me. As my frustration grew, so did my paranoia. I began to notice the black-eyed entities watching me more closely. They no longer pretended to ignore my presence. Instead, they would stop and stare as I passed, their too wide smiles never faltering. I felt like a rat in a maze, observed by cruel scientists. In a moment of desperation, I even tried to communicate with one of them, approaching an entity that looked like my old colleague Dave. "How do I get back?" I asked, my voice cracking with fear and exhaustion. The thing wearing Dave's face tilted its head at an unnatural angle. "Back?" it replied, its voice a cacophony of whispers. "But you're already home, friend. You've always been home." Its words sent a chill down my spine, and I fled, my mind reeling. Was it possible that this was my true reality? Had my memories of the other world been some sort of dream or delusion? No, I couldn't accept that. The thought of belonging to this twisted place was too horrifying to contemplate. I had to keep searching, had to find a way back to my real home. As I ran through the ever-shifting streets, I spotted my doppelganger in the distance. He was watching me, that inhuman smile still plastered on his face. And in that moment, I had a chilling realization. He wasn't just aware of my presence. He was actively preventing my escape. The hunt had begun, and I was the prey. As I continued my frantic search for an exit, I began to notice subtle changes in the inverted world. The pulsing green sky seemed to throb more intensely when I was near. The black-eyed entities would gather in groups, whispering and pointing in my direction. It was as if the very fabric of this reality was reacting to my presence, trying to either expel me or absorb me completely. One day, while hiding from a particularly persistent group of entities, I discovered an old, decaying library. The books inside were unlike anything I'd ever seen. Some written in languages that hurt my eyes to look at, others filled with moving images that seemed to tell stories without words. It was here that I stumbled upon a tome that would change everything. The book, bound in what looked disturbingly like human skin, contained accounts of others who had crossed over into this world. Some entries dated back centuries, describing similar experiences to my own. But it was the final pages that truly horrified me. They detailed a ritual, a way to complete the crossing. According to the book, those who found themselves trapped between worlds had a choice: fully embrace the inverted reality or be consumed by it. The price of embracing it, however, was steep: the obliteration of one's original self in the other world. Suddenly, my doppelganger's actions made a terrifying sort of sense. He wasn't just a twisted version of me. He was actively trying to ensure his own existence by preventing my return. As I processed this disturbing information, I heard a familiar laugh echo through the library. I looked up to see my other self standing at the end of the aisle, flanked by two of the black-eyed entities. "So now you know," he said, his voice a perfect mimicry of my own, yet underlaid with that same discordant whisper I'd heard from the other entities. "Did you really think you could just go back? This is who we are now. This is where we belong." I backed away, my mind racing. I had to find a way out, and fast. Because now I knew the truth. It wasn't just my sanity at stake, but my very existence. With my doppelganger and the entities closing in, I knew I had to act fast. I clutched the disturbing tome to my chest and ran, weaving through the impossible architecture of the library. Bookshelves shifted and moved, trying to block my path, but somehow I managed to find an exit. Once outside, I didn't stop running until I reached a place that seemed safe, an abandoned building that pulsed and breathed like a living thing. There, hidden in its depths, I pored over the book, searching desperately for any clue that could help me return to my world. After hours of reading, I found a glimmer of hope. The ritual to complete the crossing could be reversed, but it required precise timing and location. I needed to return to the exact spot where I had entered this world during what the book called the pulse, a moment when the barriers between realities were at their thinnest. The catch: the pulse occurred only once every cycle of this world's strange, pulsating sky. I had no idea how long that might be in normal time, but I knew I couldn't afford to miss it. I began to formulate a plan. I would need to return to my house, or rather, this world's version of it, and find the basement door. But I also knew that my doppelganger would be expecting this move. I would have to find a way to distract or neutralize him. As I planned, I couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The very air seemed to thicken with anticipation, and in the distance, I could hear the entities calling my name in a chorus of whispers. The final confrontation was coming, and I had to be ready. The inverted world seemed to sense my intentions. As I made my way back to the house, the environment became increasingly hostile. The ground beneath my feet would suddenly turn to quicksand, forcing me to leap from one solid patch to another. Buildings warped and twisted, their doors and windows snapping shut as I approached. The entities were everywhere now, their black eyes fixed on me, their smiles wider and more menacing than ever. They didn't try to stop me directly, but their very presence made my progress difficult, as if their collective will was reshaping reality to hinder me. As I neared the house, I saw my doppelganger standing on the porch, waiting. He looked exactly like me, but his posture was wrong. Too straight, too still, like a predator poised to strike. "You can't leave," he called out, his voice a twisted echo of my own. "This is where you belong now, where we belong." I knew I couldn't reason with him. This entity wasn't just a copy of me. It was a part of this world, bound by its twisted logic. Instead, I did the only thing I could think of. I ran straight at him. He seemed surprised by my direct approach, hesitating for just a moment. That was all I needed. I feinted to the left, then dodged right, slipping past him and through the front door. The interior of the house was a nightmare version of my home. Furniture moved of its own accord. Photographs on the walls showed horrific, ever-changing scenes. I raced through it all, heading for the basement door. Behind me, I could hear my doppelganger in pursuit, his footsteps echoing mine with perfect precision. The entities were entering the house too, their whispers growing to a deafening chorus. I reached the basement door and yanked it open, practically falling down the stairs. The basement was alive with writhing shadows, but there, in the far wall, I saw it, the ornate door that had started this whole ordeal. To hear more stories like this, subscribe and leave a like.